Hello, welcome to the ICAA. My name is Michael Dennis. I'm an architect in Boston and an emeritus professor at MIT, where I was the director of the post-professional urbanism program. I'm also the author of Court and Garden, From the French Hotel to the City of Modern Architecture, and two forthcoming books. One is titled Architecture in the City. It's a collection of essays and articles. And the other is called Temples and Towns, a study of the form, elements, and principles of planned towns. This lecture is about the language of urban form. In other words, it's about cities, how to see or read them, what is the most important thing about designing them, and what is architecture's role in forming them. The city is our most complex and important human construct. It's the most efficient form of human habitation in terms of energy consumption and carbon production on a per capita basis. There are many complex issues with cities, but the most important issue, their physical form, is relatively simple. The city's urban elements have been the same for several thousand years and across many different cultures. Like members of the same family, cities are all different, but they share important commonalities. Also, like families, there are some good, beautiful cities and some not so good, especially today. Traditionally, architecture was an integral element of the city and the city was urban, and this is important. Today, however, most architecture is anti-urban and cities are often defined by population statistics, but are not urban. For many reasons today, we need to relearn about the civics and practice of urban life. Number one, we need to relearn that cities are about urban space, not objects. We need to relearn to make urban architecture an urban landscape. Three, we need to learn that cities should be lived in, not commuted to from suburbs. This lecture is therefore a framework or an outline for further exploration of urban issues. It consists of an introduction to the major issues, some illustrations of urban life, a detailed discussion of urban elements, followed by illustrations of those elements. So let's get started. What you're seeing here is a restoration image of the Greek city of Priene in Asia Minor. It has all of the characteristics that we'll be talking about of civic spaces, urban blocks, urban fabric, and landscape. But to begin, we need to make a distinction between what we now are forced to call the traditional city. We used to call it simply the city because cities were urban. They are not all today. So the traditional city, this is Rome, by the way, an overview of Rome, Italy, is compact, dense, walkable, and it has the lowest per capita carbon footprint of any other form of human habitation. It's composed of buildings, blocks, streets, squares, gardens, parks, neighborhoods, and legible public space. This is an aerial view of Abu Dhabi and the city of modern architecture. There is sprawl. It's obviously not walkable. It has a high per capita carbon footprint. It's composed of freestanding buildings, illegible open space, and vehicular circulation. It's dominated by vehicular circulation. You cannot walk anywhere in this city, especially given the climate. So what happened? How did this happen? Well, there are basically three things, three reasons. One of those is that in the 18th century, near the middle of the 18th century, architecture transformed from kind of city of public space where individual buildings were formed background buildings to the public space to a rise in individuality, and that was reflected in the form of buildings. Picture on the top is the Palais Royal in Paris. Picture on the bottom is the city of Maupertuis, an ideal city of Maupertuis by Ledoux. And if you look at it closely, you see that each of the buildings has its own character, like we each have our own character. And Thomas Jefferson was in Paris during this time in the 1780s, and he was quite taken by neoclassical Paris. the beginnings of suburbia, if you will, because he saw in it a way of having a civilized agrarian life in America. From Thomas Jefferson to Frank Lloyd Wright, architects had an antithetic relationship to the city. So Jefferson saw in this neoclassical ideal a way of having a civilized democracy. The second thing is that in the mid-19th century, people began to move about cities. The circulation became an important thing, and streets widened, and city design reflected that movement. Until about 1850 in Paris, people grew up and lived in the same neighborhood in which they were born. But beginning in the 1850s, people began to work or go to school in different neighborhoods. The rise of carriages available to the bourgeoisie enabled this transportation. And as you can see, they had their own traffic difficulties. In fact, there are some that you don't see, but you can imagine these horses relieving themselves on the street, and it presented a whole other kind of problem. But basically, town planning changed and focused on the street rather than spaces, squares, urban blocks, and so on. The third thing is that about the same time in America, Frederick Law Olmsted, the great American landscape architect, also did not like cities. He thought that the central business districts were necessary for commerce, but that people should live out in greenery. In other words, that they should commute in and out to cities. And this has infected American urbanism and town planning and towns and villages ever since. So if you want to see the results of all of this social and formal transformation, you can look at both ends of that great east-west axis in Paris with, on the left-hand side, the Louvre, and that great axis extending out to the tall buildings in the background, La Défense, and on the right-hand side, La Défense itself. In other words, those neoclassical isolated buildings from the 18th century that had a character reflecting the personality of the owner, let's say, have become mute objects. It's like, it's not a city, it's like a junkyard for androids from outer space, leftover androids from outer space. There's no legible public space. There are only a series of pretty banal or goofy buildings. And if you look at what has happened to architecture in the meantime, these are just a random sampling from the internet. You know, if you look at only one of these things, you might go, oh, wow, that's interesting. But if you look at them in terms of whether they can make a city or not, they obviously cannot. They're narcissistic, navel-gazing architectural toy making. They're not urban buildings. They're buildings designed to get your firm on the cover of the Rolling Stone or on the cover of Architectural Record. So, three conditions are required for a city to be urban. As I said before, most cities are defined today by population statistics. 100,000 people, I suppose, is a city. But most of the time, they're not urban. To be urban, people must live in the city. In other words, that Olmsted idea doesn't work. That's not really an urban condition. Buildings must either touch or almost touch and align on the streets to define the public spaces of the city. And three, neighborhoods must be multifunctional. They're not single function zones where Leon Creer, the well-known urbanist, described single function zoning as saying, today I will only eat peas, tomorrow I will only eat meat, etc. Neighborhoods need a full diet. They need to be multifunctional to enable people to live in them. Now, historically, there have been a lot of iconic detached freestanding buildings. One of the most famous ones, of course, is the Paris Opera House by Tony Garnier, an icon of enormous beauty. But in fact, it's absorbed into the fabric of the city. Now, there were lots of complaints about Baron Haussmann's design of the plaza around the Paris Opera House. But despite the arguments, it is an integral part of the urban fabric. It aligns on this avenue, and the streets around it pour into that and support the importance of that civic building. There are other important buildings. This is the Pantheon in Paris, which in this case is not a grand boulevard leading up to it, but a tree-lined pedestrian street with cafes and statues and so forth along the edge of the square. There are fantastic urban parks in Paris. This is in the Palais Royal, which was built in the 1780s. It's a very popular place today. And there are streets that are normative streets where people live and buy groceries and go to restaurants. In this case, it's a street in the Marais section of Paris, and there's a marketplace going on in the street. And I would remind you again that until the 1850s, most people never went more than a few blocks from where they were born in their neighborhood. This is a scene along that market street. There were all kinds of different things going on there. And this is the Champs-Élysées, the famous avenue in Paris, the very wide one. And you can pretty much tell from this picture that there's an integration of architecture and landscape and urban design and social interaction. And finally, then, you don't really need all of these things, of course, to have civic life. This is a scene alongside the Seine River of 6 people having a picnic lunch, but it is enabled if you live there and if you have a whole repertoire of urban events and forms. So I think this is maybe the most important point of this presentation, which is about the difference between urban design and architectural design, or town planning and architecture, if you will. And the best example that I know of is to explain it is to say that if you are an architect and you're designing a piece of a city that is too big for you to design all the buildings, then you should switch gears and rely on town planning, not designing the buildings. These are 3 principles from the urban geographer M.R.G. Kanzen. He said there are 3 elements: the town plan, which is made up of streets, blocks, and public spaces. And this is pre-Enid down below, the early Greek Hellenic town. In other words, you can see the blocks and the public open space. That's the primary thing that town planners, landscape architects, and architects design. The second is the land use pattern, which is the parcel divisions of the blocks. And they will say more about this later. You don't always design the parcels, but it's a good thing to be aware of parcels and the building types that are going to occupy them. This is what town planners do on the left-hand side of this dotted line. The building fabric, on the other hand, building design, is what architects do. They flesh out that plan by building the buildings in 3 dimensions. And I would reiterate again that most architects think urban design is large-scale architecture. They are colossally wrong. It's a separate discipline, and it's articulate from the making of architecture. So to dive into the language of urban form, the basic urban elements are buildings, and we'll go into these not in complete detail, but some detail: blocks, streets, squares, urban fabric, neighborhoods, gardens, parks, and civic structure. Here's some rather crude diagrams. There are 3 kinds of buildings, basically, not buildings, but architectural types: freestanding buildings, attached buildings, what we call party wall buildings, and composite buildings, which have characteristics of both freestanding buildings and attached buildings. Blocks have three different forms: long rectangular blocks, square or near square blocks, and irregular blocks. Size matters, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Streets, there are several different kinds. A street is traditionally a place. It doesn't conjure up ideas of automobile circulation. It's a place, and it depends on the proportion of the street, of the plan and the section. An avenue is a major, broader street that goes from point to point. In Boston, you'll see Commonwealth Avenue, which goes from one monument to another monument. A boulevard is a traffic street, generally speaking, that is articulated into a series of lateral zones across the street. It's a tree-lined street, and you'll see examples from Paris and Boston. A drive, technically speaking, is a one-sided street. It's a drive along an open space next to a park or an open landscape. And squares also have three general types. One is a unified square that has closure and is legible, that you can see what it is. Second one is a composite one where there's a kind of balance between the open space of the square and a dominant building, in this case in the corner. And the third kind is like a medieval square with a cathedral in the middle. This happens to be Florence, Piazza del Duomo in Florence, where it's the figurative building that gives the character of the space, and it's almost as if it was carved out of the city and placed in it. Urban fabric is basically like any kind of fabric. It's made up of blocks and streets, and it is not a neighborhood in its own right, but it's basically the pattern that repeats, the urban pattern that can repeat enough to become a neighborhood. Neighborhoods or quarters on the quartier, on the other hand, are bits of urban fabric that have a kind of civic structure of streets and squares within them. They tend to have three characteristics: a clear center, a consistent fabric, and a clear edge. Not all of these are always present. If you go to New York City, for example, you don't see clear edges usually to the various neighborhoods. But if you ask residents of those neighborhoods, they will tell you exactly where the border is between one neighborhood and the next. Gardens then are unique places. They're usually bounded. They have specimen landscape elements, and traditionally they were the mediating element between the city and the open countryside. In other words, historically, cities were considered to be sacred and the open countryside wild and profane, and gardens mediated between those two things. So in typically gardens, you will find in Italy, in France, you will find grotesque and demons from another world. They're like a caricature of life. Parks are, on the other hand, generally informal. They're large. They may have an irregular shape, or they may have a regular shape. They are usually picturesque, but not always. Historically, there were formal parks, hunting parks, but in the 19th century, they were transformed, most places, in a more picturesque English landscape kind of elements. Finally, then, the civic structure is elusive. It's an elusive idea, but it's really the figurative sequence of important spaces and buildings. And a way to think about it is like the human anatomy. And you have an important line around the outside of your body, but you also have a sequence of anatomically important things like lungs and stomach and so on. And you can apply that then to cities as a way of being able to diagram them and comprehend what's going on. So let's take a look. Here are the three examples of freestanding, attached, and composite buildings. This is the Christian Science Church in Boston. These are houses along the edge of Beacon Hill. You can see they're all party wall houses. They're relatively narrow. Boston was planned fundamentally on a 25-foot module, but that varies considerably. And then finally, the State House, which on the front has a gold dome, which you see from all over Boston. It has a very prominent classical building by Charles Bulfinch facing the Common, the Boston Common. It has two wings that were added to frame it and provide additional functions in the 19th century. And then it has a kind of workaday behind, which appears to stick into the urban fabric. So it's simultaneously part of the fabric. If you walk around this building, you don't know that you're going around an important civic building. You think you're just going around a larger building than the houses on the side. So if you look at it from the aerial view, you can see all of these buildings here, rather bad buildings and a rather bad urban condition. It's not a great place to be, but freestanding modern buildings. Here are all of the attached buildings, relatively narrow parcels, which have the characteristics that we have of an axis that is the axis, a vertical axis, that's the axis of our body. So as we walk along the street, we have a kind of anthropocentric relationship to our environment. And then finally, again, the State House, looking down through the Boston Common, an important church on this corner that's also part of the urban fabric and part iconography. So if we then look at three examples, this Greek temple on the left-hand side from about 400 BC, this freestanding Renaissance church in Italy, and then the New York Public Library, one of those Beaux-Arts buildings that was produced in the 19th and early 20th centuries when the number of and kind of civic buildings began to expand. It is a freestanding building, but it's also part of the urban fabric. You can see on the side, it aligns on the street like these other buildings. So it's both an icon and part of the fabric of the city. If you then look at a series of party wall buildings, you've seen these houses before. In Back Bay, these houses are butted together. They're party wall buildings with a whole series, a whole language of bay windows and entrances and stoops and landscape in front that make a kind of unified urban ensemble. In fact, it becomes sometimes very difficult to tell which part of the thing is the actual building. It's like a large building that has variety. These buildings, this is in New York City, Harlem on the left-hand side and Paris on the right-hand side, are even more blended together. This is difficult to do today, of course, because people want to, every building owner wants to scream loudly to profess his importance in the city and express his or her personality. But if you look at these, here's a building, it's 5 bays wide from here to here. Here's a hotel from here to here, another hotel. This was our window when we were staying there. And these provide a kind of unified idea of the street and a kind of common building height. Other buildings where you can argue that it's difficult to see the individual buildings in this crescent, the Royal Crescent in Bath, England, because it has a highly unified facade. If you look closely, however, you can see the doors, the entry points along the crescent. On the backside, it's shaggy and ad hoc. People have added on pieces like this. And the same thing with the Circus in Bath. This is a building on another square, which is designed like a giant palazzo. But in fact, if you look closely at the entrances, It's made up of a series of smaller party wall buildings. And I have arguments with a friend of mine about this, but the buildings don't actually have to touch. It's usually better if they do, but here's a scene of the Grand Canal in Venice where the buildings do not touch, but they're close enough that you get the identity of the street. You can read the street, in this case, a canal, and it functions equally well to define the public spaces of the city. Moving on then to the composite building types, here are three examples. This is the Piazza Signoria in Florence. There is a Palazzo Vecchio. Actually, I should have said this is the Palazzo Vecchio. It's in three parts, this part, and this part. So that on the plaza side, it's an icon, it's a dominant kind of building, but in fact, it's nestled in, it's melded into the building fabric. This is the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. It's really a composite of several buildings, which we'll see in just the next slide. And there's another view of the State House in Boston. Here's a plan of the Hofburg. This is what you saw a moment ago. There's that courtyard, and there's the building defining that space in Vienna, and it goes on around like this, and then finally back out. So it really performs a number of urban tasks in the city of Vienna. Remarkable building. Moving on to the idea of blocks. There are two major characteristics to blocks: form types and size, and parcel size. Form types are long rectangular blocks, near square or square, and irregular. Here are three aerial views from blocks in Boston. A long rectangular block, it's about 240 feet wide, in this case 250, I'm sorry. It has an alley down the middle, very narrow alley, and spaces for gardens and car parking and so forth in the center. Here's a square block with an alley through it. And then finally, an irregular block with a very expensive hotel here on the corner and a series of irregular buildings. These were all built at different times. These are 18th century buildings. They're quite small. This is a beautiful, beautiful part of Boston. You should note that the idea of an urban block is that there's a continuous, legible public exterior and often a private interior to the block, no matter what the configuration is. And the size is important, as are the parcels. This is a New York City block, which was planned in 1811. They're 200 feet wide by 400, 600, and 800 feet long. They're divided into parcels that are 25 feet wide by 100 feet deep. Now, these vary, of course, because people buy sometimes more than one, and they vary slightly. So every one of these parcels is about 2,500 square feet. It's kind of interesting that in the classic Greek planning, the blocks were about 100 feet with a kind of very small street and another 100-foot block. And the parcels are about 50 by 50. In other words, they're the same area, 2,500 square feet, as the New York City blocks. And you'll note that the New York City block does not have an alley. The size of blocks is a big argument. If you, it's a polemical and matter of principle that you have blocks that range in size from, in this case of Timgad, the Roman city in North Africa, the blocks are about 60 feet square. In Turin, Italy, this is a composite plan of the Roman plan of Turin and the contemporary plan, or the present day city. The blocks are about 240 feet square. In Barcelona, the Cerdà portion of Barcelona, which we'll see in a moment, the blocks are 372 feet square. That's a very big block. But in China, it's not uncommon to find blocks that are 1,000, 3,000 feet long. As you walk down this street in Barcelona, you get the idea of these spaces at each intersection, and the blocks don't seem so big. But as the blocks get bigger, there's a question about what you do on the interior. So this is a little bit crazy, I will admit, but Rome is a classic example of irregular blocks. And if you have ever tried to do this, you will find that it's virtually impossible to design an irregular pattern. Rome is a composite city that's grown up over the centuries. And these are the irregular blocks. You can see all of the squares. This is the Pantheon, quite a beautiful square here, and the Piazza Navona over here. If you make a kind of transparent drawing, an X-ray drawing, and you put in the semi-public spaces of the courtyards, this is the pattern that you get. And if you then go further and put in the buildings, the public buildings, semi-public buildings, this is the pattern you get. So you begin to get a feel for the texture and the nuance of the city. It's got a great range of from small to large spaces and buildings. And then finally, if you turn the X-ray machine up further, you get the pattern of the architectural buildings inside. You could never design any one of these four things, I think, sitting from scratch, because it's built up over hundreds of years. Now, streets are probably the primary element of urban design and urban planning. And typically, historically, they've been the primary means of integrating architecture and civic space or urbanism. On the left-hand side, this is the building regulation, the building law after the Great Fire in London in 1666. In order to rebuild, if you were building on a small street, you could build a two-story house with an attic. If you were building on a slightly bigger street, you could and had to build, not you could, you had to build a building at least 3 stories high with an attic, and so forth and so on. Finally, to the major streets reflected on the right-hand side. In Manhattan, the building regulation, the building code of 1916 is called a step-back zoning ordinance, which said that if a building is 100 feet wide, it can be only 150 feet high. And that's a good proportion, because if you're going to define the space of the street, you need to have at least a 1-to-1 proportion to define the space. The further you move the buildings apart from each other, the weaker the spatial definition and the less you tend to read the space of the street. So they invented this thing called a sky plane, which starts in the middle of a 100-foot wide street and goes up to the 150-foot point right here. And everything above that line has to step back. So when you look at Manhattan, you look at the buildings on the west side of Central Park, you can just literally see the reading. So this makes a kind of an amazing thing. It defines the fabric of the city at the lower level of the city and allows skyscrapers to emerge from that urban fabric. So let's look at a few streets across the world. This is a 10-foot wide street in Venice, Italy, on the very left-hand side. And in Barcelona, those large 370-foot wide blocks are sometimes divided in the middle. And when they are, the street is about 23 feet wide. In fact, in Boston, you can find, and Providence, Rhode Island, you can find beautiful streets that are 20, 25 feet wide, 30 feet wide. The third one over, the 30-foot wide street, is in Barceloneta, in Barcelona, where you'll see it in a moment. The buildings and the streets are roughly 30, 32 feet wide. This is where my office was in downtown Boston. It's a major street. It's 60 feet wide. And finally then, two views. On the left, an upper East Side Manhattan street. All of those streets are 60 feet wide. The sidewalks vary slightly, but they're quite beautiful residential streets. And on the in the right-hand image, that's the view of the Paris Opera House and those the Haussmannian apartment buildings lining the avenue leading down to the building, integrating that iconographic object or civic building into the fabric of the city. I love this painting by Blanchard. It's a late 19th century Paris painting of the boulevards that Haussmann developed. You can see that the street is quite wide, but it's reinforced by these lines of trees. The landscape is integrated into the idea of the street, which creates a people space between the building and the trees and separates the pedestrian zone from the traffic of, in this case, horses and carriages. So it delineates the various lanes of activity. You should also notice that pedestrians are mixing it up with carriages and horses and so on. This is precisely the system of the Avenue des Champs-Élysées in Paris. Here it is leading from the Louvre back out to the Arc de Triomphe. It is 230 feet wide, but it's articulated into smaller spaces by the trees. And this is Commonwealth Avenue. This part right here is Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. This is the Back Bay. This is Beacon Street and two other streets and Commonwealth Avenue, which is actually 240 feet wide. It's wider, 10 feet wider than the Champs-Élysées in Paris, but it has a beautiful park down the center. So it's really like two streets put together, two avenues put together. Now, streets are probably the most important ingredient of town planning, but squares are also important. We don't, because of when we were born as a nation, we don't have a great tradition of squares in the US, but we have some. In general, the whole history of squares is one from a condition of stasis, let's say, where there are clearly defined squares that have closure to ones where they begin to extend the idea of space. This is a Baroque sequence of spaces. And then finally, the sequence at Versailles, where space is extended finally to the horizon line. And then in the 19th century, squares become traffic circles, because as that movement came about in cities, squares begin to disintegrate, and then finally they disappear in the 20th century with modernism. Here's an example of one of the early ones. This is the Ducal Square in Vigevano, Italy, a small town outside of Milano. It's very clear. It's not a medieval square. It's very clear. It has a clear cornice around the outside edge. The corners are closed, and it's quite beautiful. This is another one in Florence, the Piazza Santissima Annunziata, which is this church. It's very regular with a colonnade on one side and a colonnade on the other side. And the church has a colonnade as well. So it's unified, even though there's a kind of dominant object. This is the Piazza Signoria that we saw earlier, with the Palazzo Vecchio here, kind of domineering sort of building. And then it's tucked into the fabric. You almost can't tell where it begins and ends on the other sides. And there you see it from the ground level. The Duomo in Florence, of course, is a medieval cathedral, like the ones in France, with buildings jostling around the outside. It's almost as if it was jammed into the urban fabric, and parts of it are clear, like this square in front that has the baptistry in it, but Back behind, it reads as a kind of freestanding building, kind of centralized church. Interestingly, New York City, Manhattan, has what is probably the best urban space of the 20th century in Rockefeller Center. And you notice in the plan, these blocks are 200-foot blocks with 60-foot streets. The avenues are 100, 125 feet across. So there's this small alley-like space leading up to the plaza of Rockefeller Center, which you can see here down below. And in this case, the view towards the tall building. These are all modern buildings, modernist buildings, if you will. And there's the skating rink in the wintertime in the plaza of Central Park. It's magical at Christmas time, especially. It's one of the best spaces that we have. And here, this really, you could print this out, but it's a series of plots from various places at the same scale. Rockefeller Center, you see down here on the lower right-hand corner, and the Campidoglio in Rome is here. The sequence of spaces at Nancy, France is over here, and the Piazza Navona over here. None of these spaces are gigantic spaces. The Place des Vosges in Paris, what is today the Place des Vosges, is about 450 feet square, 450 by 475 feet. And that's getting on the larger size. So size matters also for these spaces. Historically, the spaces like a Pompeian Forum were a little over 100 feet wide. That's the space of a street many times today. So let's then look at a series of several bits of urban fabric. This is Barceloneta in Barcelona, obviously, with a market building here, and a series of blocks. It's like a mini Manhattan. These blocks are about 30, 32 feet deep, which is a kind of, in many ways, an ideal depth for housing. And the streets are about 30 feet wide. So when you walk into this neighborhood, you hardly realize that you're in a diminutive environment. It's like you saw the streets a moment ago. It's like a mini Manhattan. The other set of small blocks are the so-called Spagnoli blocks in Naples, Italy. These are about 60 feet square. Streets are quite narrow, and you can see the contrast to these other Naples blocks on the right-hand side. But it's a vibrant, active neighborhood. This is Back Bay in Boston. Again, the streets, these blocks are 240 feet wide. These are 250. This is Commonwealth Avenue. And the length of these blocks varies from around 400 feet to around 500 or 600 feet long. And they have alleys and spaces in the middle. This is Barcelona, the Cerdà blocks, Alphonse Cerdà, who planned the area. 370 feet nominally, with 60-foot chamfered corners and various ways of using the interiors of the blocks. Cerdà originally wanted it to be a public space in the middle, but in fact, as it reacted to development pressures, they got filled in more and more. If you then take the idea of that urban fabric and expand it to the idea of a neighborhood, which again may have all of three characteristics, or at least some of them: a clear center, consistent fabric, and a clear edge. If you look at the idea of a Roman city, which is roughly 1,200 by 1,500 feet, and can be, if you put what we call a walking shed, a circle over this, for a 5 or 10 minute walk. Everything is a multifunctional neighborhood within a 5 or 10 minute walk. This is again the plan of Priene, Greece. It has a clear center, a consistent fabric of all equal parcels. And in this case, a clear edge because it was a walls city. In Boston, the North End, Boston has a series of very different neighborhoods that were connected to each other until the late 50s when the Highway Act came in. And when they began to cut highways through Boston, it exposed the edges of the neighborhood. You can see here, this is the so-called Greenway today. It was the Crosstown Expressway before, but it isolated this portion of Boston, the North End, which is now primarily the Italian section. It has a main street, which is the center. It has very fine grained fabric, and it has a clear edge both to the Greenway and to the outside, to the harbor on the outside. This is the overview of Barceloneta that you saw just a moment ago. It started as a fishing village and then got built up to its present density. It has one edge along the waterfront. It has another edge along the bottom with restaurants and so forth, looking over the harbor. Moving on then to the idea of gardens. This is the public garden in Boston. When I first moved to Boston 40 years ago, I didn't understand there's a fence right along here, and there's a sidewalk here, and there's a sidewalk inside the garden. Until I realized that if you're walking along here, you're outside the garden. Sounds stupid, but if you walk along here, you're in the garden. And it's picturesque. It has landscape specimens. When there's not the COVID virus going on, this lake, which is only about 3 feet deep, has swan boats that young teenagers paddle around for tourists. A more characteristic garden, one that does mediate between the city, the sacred, and the profane of the outside landscape, is the Boboli Garden in Florence. This is the Pitti Palace with a gigantic palace facade to the city on this side, a courtyard, and then a connection out to the garden, which is planned like a city in its own right. It has blocks and it has squares, it has an amphitheater, and so on. And it has statuary and iconography and so on. Parks are like less precise, less symbolically loaded, in many ways less designed, or they're made to appear less designed. Rolling landscapes with trees, generally speaking, not in alleys of trees lined up, but picturesque open space. Informal, in other words, large and irregular and open to everyone. Not particularly urban necessarily. In Paris, there are a whole series of landscape elements, not just boulevards, but parks that are urban parks. They're often not even picturesque parks like this one, the Butte Chaumont in, northeastern Paris. But in the US, we have a huge park movement that began in the 19th century. Again, Olmsted, who planned Central Park and Prospect Park, which we'll see in a moment, didn't like cities. He thought you needed them for business purposes. But he made this park as a kind of alternative universe so that you could go from the dense compactness of the city into this park and be like in a parallel universe, a parallel urban condition. There you see a view of it. And for most places in Central Park, you really don't see buildings, which is part of the idea. And it's certainly part of the idea for Prospect Park. Here's the primary entrance to Prospect Park right here. It's through a tunnel. It's not that you walk in off of this public space. You go through a tunnel and open out into this great, what's called the Long Meadow. Along these sides, you don't really get in. There's a fence along this edge, And it's rough and scruffy so that you don't see into the park and people in the park don't see you. And in other words, on this side, you're in the city, but when you go into the park, you don't see buildings and you're in this alternative world, a respite from the city. So to take a look at the idea of what is one of the most difficult ideas of civic structure that I know to pin down is an aerial photograph of Boston with the harbor here and the Charles River over here. This is Back Bay, this is Beacon Hill, this is the West End, this is the North End, this is the financial district. Here's Commonwealth Avenue, the Public Garden, the Boston Common, the State House, and City Hall Plaza or Government Center. If you imagine that this is a person, an anatomical drawing of a person, you have the outline of the body, you have this primary axis or primary figure of public space that then connects to the State House and down through this sequence to City Hall, and then down through the North End and out to the sea. This is called the walk to the sea. You have other elements that are related to that primary anatomy, but this is sort of the image, and this is a way that you can keep track of what the city is about its form, even though it's complex. So it might be fun after that somewhat tedious description of urban elements to just take a look at some of them and enjoy them. This is an aerial photograph of Bordeaux. There are quite a few slides here of Bordeaux, France. It has the best wine in the world, and it's quite a beautiful and sexy city. This is an 18th century square that opens to the Garonne River. It used to be a working waterfront, but in modern times, it has had a landscape addition, one of the most beautiful modern landscapes, I think, that provides a public front and a public amenity for the city. In a moment, you're going to see a tram that goes through here, and that also goes through this park right here. There's what is called a water mirror. It's an 1.5 inches deep of water on these paving stones, out of which steam rises, and people play and do plays in this. The steam will subside and the water will come back up again. This is a view at nighttime as it reflects the square behind, and there's the tram going through it. Quite an amazing thing. And it's not a big deal to have an integration of public transportation, in this case the tram, no fences, no guardrails, the tram goes slowly, and they probably would arrest you and fine you if you got hit by it because you would be too dumb to be in the city. But it's going through this public park. Here's a view at nighttime in one of the squares. Social life in public. One of the really beautiful streets, a pedestrian street. And there is also fun. There are sculptures of cows all over Bordeaux. I'm not sure whether they're permanent or not, but I like this one with a nice glass of Bordeaux wine. And another view of city life. This is an aerial view of Boston, of course. You can see this is a really quite beautiful square in Beacon Hill. If you have a few $1 million, you might be able to buy one floor of a condo building. And this is a view of that square, these brick row houses and the park in the center, modeled on English models. This is Barcelona again, with a loggia on the side and the square on the right-hand side with a grid of palm trees. And this is the famous Ramblas, the street that goes up from the sea up the hill in Barcelona. And this is Savannah, Georgia, planned as a grid town with squares, a pattern of squares, all different in this regular pattern, and a big one here. Here's a view. They're all filled with these fantastic live oak trees, which are not only amazing trees, but they're tall enough, the canopy is high enough that it shelters you in the heat of the summer and allows you to see the space of the square through the trees. This is a square in Venice. No trees, almost no trees ever in squares in Venice or on the streets because, among other things, they're too narrow. If you have to put trees in streets, then your streets are getting pretty wide. And a view, this I just thought was such a stunning photograph. I could not show it. It's the Piazzetta, the little square that leads in from the water into the Piazza San Marco in Venice, and the square itself with St. Mark's at the end. This is in Guangzhou, China. It's the British planned section of the historic town with, again, an integration of the buildings along the side with the pedestrian circulation and the landscape and the vehicular circulation, and the same thing again on the other side. Quite a beautiful area of Guangzhou. And another example of the integration of landscape and pedestrian circulation and the buildings. And then lastly, the kind of wacko cacophonous view of Hong Kong, where the architecture is almost unimportant. It is unimportant because it's made by signs. The signs and the cafes and shops on the ground level give the street its character. Another view where the signs sometimes span clear across the street. They do the same thing that the trees in Paris do. They define this people layer of space at the bottom, the lower level of the street. And that's what really matters more than skyscrapers and the things that are higher than that. Now, these are my drawings of cities. This is Florence, this is Rome, this is other pieces of Rome. I think one needs to look carefully at the city and draw its elements and its components in the same way that we draw and analyze buildings, or in an analogous way. And it's a tricky thing. It's not easy, but it's the way you learn about cities, of going to see them and trying to figure out what the relationship of architecture and landscape is to those cities. And this is just to remind you, it's a little bit of a pitch for a book which should be out in July. The first essay talks about the sequence from the Pitti Palace through Vasari's corridor over the river and into the Uffizi and into the Piazza Signoria, and then finally down to the Duomo. You can see the Roman grid right here, kinked at an angle to the river. The point is that we need to refine the idea of the traditional city, where architecture is a contributing component to the fabric of the city, not anti-urban, but a contributing component to it. And the same thing for landscape. This is crucially important today because the city is the most efficient form of human habitation in terms of energy consumption and carbon production. If we're going to survive on Earth through what many people call the sixth extinction that we're in, we need to have a revolution about education and about architecture and about landscape. So thank you very much. I encourage you to think about these things and draw them.